And so, as everybody by now knows, early in January, the offices of a publication in Paris called Charlie Hebdo were attacked by Islamic terrorists. 12 people were murdered at the offices, and I put this up on the screen because this was the subject. This was the reason. This was the reason that, or among the reasons that Charlie Hebdo was attacked. They published cartoons like these, and they had done so over a number of years, that offended Muslims. And I think it's worth pausing for a moment and reflecting on the fact that in today's day and age, with the technology that we have, with the embrace or the supposed embrace of freedom of speech across the world, that there are people willing to kill for what other people say. I want to focus on the attitude toward free speech, not only here in America, but I think in the Western world generally, because I think that we are developing an attitude, and we can see this attitude after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, that I think is very ominous and is dangerous to the continued vitality of freedom of speech. Now, I would characterize that view as the yes, but view, right? So you heard this after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and I'll give you some examples of this in a minute. It's, yes, free speech is important, but you shouldn't offend people's religion. Or, yes, free speech is important, but you shouldn't criticize ideas that other people hold dear. Let me recount a few of the ways in which we've seen this since the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and then I'll talk about what I think this means. So soon after the attacks, Pope Francis actually said essentially what I just said. Here's what he said. He said he stressed that the Paris attack was not justified, but, he added, that the reaction could have been expected. The reaction being the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. According to the Pope, Charlie Hebdo were provocateurs, and he said, quote, "You cannot insult the faith of others." Not too long after the Paris attacks, there was a journalism professor from a university in West Virginia who wrote an article for USA Today, and he said that Charlie Hebdo's mocking pictures of Muhammad were, quote, "beyond the limits of the endurable and outside the protections of the First Amendment." This is a journalism professor, okay? Now, this isn't the first time this kind of attitude that we've seen, this kind of attitude. Indeed, after the Danish cartoon controversy back in 2006, the Bush administration made clear that it had great sympathy for those who were offended and outraged by it. And remember, this was a controversy in which many Muslims worldwide were calling for the deaths of not only the cartoonists, but the editor of the publication, Fleming Rose, and there were actual attacks. I talked about the attacks on Kurt Westergaard earlier, and this is what the Bush administration found fit to say. Quote, "We find them offensive," that is the cartoons, "and we certainly understand why Muslims would find these images offensive." Now, I submit that if this is the attitude after people are being threatened and even killed for speaking out, that those who are saying this, what I've called the yes but attitude, care far more about not offending people than they do about freedom of speech. This is a very ominous development in my view. It is typified by this yes but. One way you could characterize it is free speech is important, but it doesn't include the right to offend people. Now, my view is the exact opposite of that. Free speech absolutely includes the right to offend people. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the idea that free speech doesn't include the right to offend is the same thing as saying there is no such thing as free speech. If we take freedom of speech seriously and the freedom of thought that underlies it, we absolutely have to be willing to offend people. That's the case I want to make today. I think freedom of speech is under siege in the world today, not just in America and not just on college campuses. But the primary culprit for that is not terrorist attacks. Okay, that's bad, obviously, and it does amount to an attack on free speech, but it is an attack on free speech primarily if and because we are not prepared to stand up to it. Not just physically i.e. sending the military or the police to protect people or to go after the bad guys, so to speak. But morally, we have to be willing to say, especially in the face of attacks like this, we absolutely have the right to offend you, and if you don't like it, the answer is to talk back, to debate, to disagree, or to walk away. But terror and force are absolutely verboten. They are absolutely off the table. Now that, I think, the attitude that allows that to creep in, the idea that that we should feel some sympathy for people who attack others for speaking, that's a kind of appeasing attitude, and that, I think, is exactly what breeds the kind of terror we're seeing today. And if we don't stop it, we're going to see more of it. So that's the case I want to make.